The Bob Murphy Show, episode 149.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Well, people demanded it, and I've got George Selgin on the podcast today. Don't worry, in the last, 30 to 40% of the episode, we do talk about our differences with respect to fractional reserve banking. So that's in there. We knew couldn't possibly have George on without devoting at least some time to that. But before we get into that, we talk about his general background, how he got into Austrian economics. He gives some good history of the Austrian school from his personal experience, some of you may enjoy. And we also talk about Bitcoin and MMT, which I think a lot of you folks are going to appreciate. And then, yes, we do get into the fractional reserve debate stuff. So I would say if you haven't already read the material or watched my debate with George when we were at the Soho Forum, it would make sense to do that stuff first. Okay, so George, we try not to assume too much on the part of the listener, but you're going to get more out of the exchange, George and I, because we get pretty deep pretty fast. All right, and so I would suggest if you really want to understand the back and forth that we go through here, that you first watch the debate we had at the Soho Forum, and then if you really want to get into it, check out some of the links that I'll put. So it's going to be bobmurphyshow.com/149. So the only thing you really need to read from me is going to be my recent QJ article called More Than Quibbles. And that's all you need from me. Like, that's self-contained. That gives you the history and everything you need. And then I'll put some of George's stuff, some of the things like he might have co-authored with Larry White, where you can get his perspective. Unfortunately, it's going to be hard for you to get into. What I mean is, in order to understand some of the things that I'm critiquing from George's perspective or from his body of work, you would have to go read a whole book that he wrote. Okay, so obviously that might be tricky. So I'll list some of those things, but in terms of you just reading quick things to get up to speed, I will have those available, but also the longer stuff. So, like I say, I would recommend you watch the Soho Forum debate and then read at least my quibbles piece and the piece that I'll put where they say we are not Devo, we're Misesians, that he did with Larry White, to understand their basic position on fractional reserve banking. Also, I'll list a bunch of things that George has done at what's called Alt-M, that's more recent, where he talks about Canada and whatnot, and where he responds to my critique of him that has all come out since the Soho debate. So everything's there. Finally, before I let things loose here, let me just read you his official bio. George Selgin is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute and professor emeritus of economics at the University of Georgia. His research covers a broad range of topics within the field of monetary economics, including monetary history, macroeconomic theory, and the history of monetary thought. He is the author of The Theory of Free Banking, Good Money, Money Free and Unfree, Less Than Zero, The Case for a Falling Price Level in a Growing Economy, and most recently, Floored, How a Misguided Fed Experiment Deepened and Prolonged the Great Recession. So without further ado, here is my discussion with George Selgin. Well, George, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Well, thanks for having me, Bob.
So,
looking forward to it.
Me too. So why don't we start, as I do with most of my guests that I know the listeners are familiar with. Can you just tell us some of your early background and how did you get into economics? How old were you when you got into these ideas?
Well, getting into economics was one of the few things I did because of advice from my father, who seldom gave me serious advice. Most of his advice was facetious or negative, like whatever you do, don't do what I've done. That was a typical piece of my father's advice. But for some reason, he encouraged me to study economics at one point. I was in college studying marine biology, which was my main interest. I decided to take some econ classes on his advice, and I ultimately did get a second major. It turned out that my dad had wanted me to become an economist so I could show all these idiotic free market economists why their arguments were wrong.
Are you being serious?
Yeah. He was basically a socialist at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And some of your listeners might think that he would be pleased with the outcome, but he wasn't.
At least you're sound on banking, he would think, right? That's a little joke. Come on.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, no, in fact, predictably, we ended up arguing a lot after I became a fan of some of the very people he thought I would be criticizing. But ultimately, he kind of came around to thinking maybe I wasn't a complete idiot. And this was after the fall of the Soviet Union in particular. But thus he got older and more mellow, which he'd never been before. Anyway, so that's the ironic story of how I first got into economics. There was also a separate story about how I got into monetary economics and Austrian economics. I tried to combine my interest in economics and in marine science by going for a marine resource economics degree at the University of Rhode Island. And I found the courses very boring, and they didn't give me what I liked about either econ or marine science. So this was when the big inflation was going on, and big, of course, meaning double digit. So I found myself wanting to learn more about that and more about econ generally, because my econ degree had been a pretty rushed thing. I started reading everything I could get my hands on about monetary economics. And my friend Clint Bolick, who was a colleague of mine, a dorm mate of mine at Drew University, he pointed me to the Austrian economists. So I read Theory of Money and Credit, among many other books I was reading on money, and I was bowled over by it. I still am. For the date it was written, I still think it was the best thing on money that had been written up to that point, general treatise anyway. And then I read Hayek, Denationalization of Money. And as you could guess, between them, those things led me on what became my research.
So at this point, were you in graduate school?
I was in University of Rhode Island in graduate school, a master's degree program. I ended up quitting that program and going to NYU to study with Larry White because of my interest in the kinds of issues that Hayek was raising in his pamphlet grew to the point where I realized I wanted to pursue that rather than what I'd been planning to do. So that's the short version of how I got steered into all this stuff.
It's funny you bring up the marine biology thing just as an aside. When I was an undergrad at Hillsdale College, I was on the debate team, and one year the resolution was something like, humanity must protect the Earth's natural ocean resources or something. And so my partner and I, when we had the affirmative, we did a privatization of the oceans and all, thing like everyone owns the whales and everything. And we never lost with that because the other teams were just like, that was such a crazy idea to them. Like they didn't even prepare for it. And so,
prepared for that.
Right. And of course, any objection they had to us, we were just, easily knocking it back over the neck because we were, trained Rothbardians at that point. So, now I know I've read stuff from you about like, how did you hook up with Leland Yeager?
Oh, goodness. I'm not sure I can quite remember exactly. I certainly ran into him fairly early on, and sometime after I started at NYU, met him at some events, I read his work. I can't remember when I first met him, but I do know that we were corresponding from a fairly early time and ended up corresponding quite often. And as you as you know, he certainly became one of my favorite economists, one of my favorite people, actually. I just absolutely loved interacting with him. And I did go down to Auburn to give papers a couple times. I think by then I must already have been at George Mason, but it may even have been the case that I went for the first time when I was finishing up at NYU.
Okay, so is it fair to say you already knew you wanted to go into like monetary economics and then you...
By the time I met Leland, I was already doing monetary economics. I had already made that decision. I don't believe I became familiar with his work until after I was at NYU. I may have read some of it before. As I said, I read a whole bunch of stuff.
Sure.
But I can't swear that I was very familiar or particularly familiar with his work until after I was in grad school.
Okay, so just in terms of the intellectual history of ideas, then, is it correct to say Larry White was what we now call a free banker, and then you were persuaded by his work, and then that's what you became, and then you read Leland Yeager's work on monetary disequilibrium and realized, oh wait, this is applicable to my research program? Are those correct? Or
at some point, Yeager's work became part of my stock of knowledge, but I can't remember exactly when. What happened with Larry was that first, as I told you, I'd already been interested in the work and impressed by the works of Mises and Hayek, particularly on monetary economics. And then I applied for an IHS grant. This was back in 79 or something like that, 80, I guess, for summer research. And I did a project. The title was something like Competition and Currency in the Monopoly of Money, or something like that. And what I did was I looked at U.S. history, U.S. banking and monetary history, with Hayek's radical thesis in mind that we don't need government. And so I looked at that history and I was asking the question, what would it have been like if the government hadn't been interfering so much? Would the system have worked better? It wasn't quite testing Hayek's hypothesis because I wasn't looking into competing fiat monies or anything like that. I was just asking whether regulatory interference was part of the solution or part of the problem. Well, it was part of the problem as far as I was concerned, and arriving at that conclusion was like shooting fish in a barrel. You couldn't look at the history of U.S. banking and consider that hypothesis and not realize how often the government regulations were themselves the source of instability, banknote discounts, bank failures, you name it. So I was absolutely convinced part of that project involved, of course, I communicated with Walter Grinder and others at IHS. At one point, Walter told me about Larry's work at UCLA. He was still a grad student. And he sent me some of the chapters. And I corresponded with Larry, was so impressed by his work on Scottish banking that I wrote to him and said, look, when you get out and get a job teaching, let me know where. I'll come and be your first student. As it happens, I'd independently applied for the graduate program at NYU already. Well, I got accepted to the program. Larry got a job offer from NYU, and we both showed up together in the fall of, I think it was the fall of 81, might have been 80. And I became his first student that way. So that's how that happened. And then my other influences like Yeager, et cetera, were through my readings initially while doing work, continuing to do work in that area.
Okay, can you tell us, so who Kerzner was there? Was Rizzo there at that point?
Yes, Kerzner, Rizzo, Lockman occasionally. And then, of course, Jerry O'Driscoll was just on his way out. Larry was his replacement, as it were. Then also we had Fritz Machlup. I took a class with Machlup. And Anna Schwartz was on my committee. She was not in the faculty. She was upstairs or downstairs, I can't remember which, in the NBER offices. And then there were visitors like Bruce Caldwell and Dick Langlois and so on. I think David Glasner spent some time there. Now I can't remember, but I know I interacted with him a lot, so he must have been one of them. It's a lot of good people came through.
Sure.
As you know, there were always people coming through.
Oh, yeah, right. So at that point, was there, because when I was there later, of course, there was like a weekly Austrian colloquium? Did they have that at the
had
time?
been going on.
Okay.
Yes, indeed, yes. I presented Praxeology and Understanding at that colloquium, and I dare say it was one of the most controversial Austrian colloquiums that they ever had.
It's funny because I was gonna read a passage from that in a little bit, and then like have the listener say, "Who do you think that was?" Because obviously they wouldn't have guessed it would be you. So I do want to come back to that.
Feel free to read it. I might not guess it was me either.
Yeah.
Right now.
So, okay, if you don't mind me just asking, because what happens a lot is, there's certain names that people hear, but they don't know too much about them. So, like, for example, can you just tell us a little bit about, actually, you mentioned Hayek's denationalization of money. So for the benefit of listeners who, Hayek's the road to serfdom guy. I know he worked, Mises business. Like, what are you talking about? Denationalization of money. What is that?
Denationalization of Money was a pamphlet Hayek wrote towards the end of his career. And it, too, was a response to the high inflation that had broken out in the late 70s, early 80s, not just in the U.S., but elsewhere in the world, a lot of places. And it was essentially Hayek throwing up his hands and saying, these central banks, you just can't count on them. They're just not working out. So instead of recommending any sort of rule or strategy or even a gold standard with central banks, he found himself suggesting that the only reliable solution was to rely on competition as a source of discipline in money creation. But he was not thinking about free banking in the way that of the sort that Larry and I discussed, where the banks are issuing IOUs that are redeemable in gold or silver or even in some extent central bank money. He was thinking about competition among fiat money issuing institutions, both public and private. And his argument in the pamphlet was that if you really opened the field to such competition with freedom of entry and all that, you would end up with banks competing by committing to maintain the purchasing power of their currencies, and those that did a better job of it would ultimately win out. And they would all have to be disciplined by the public. They would all end up being disciplined by a public that punishes those banks that don't keep the purchasing power of their currencies stable, don't commit to it, or don't stick to their commitments. It was a fascinating thesis. I ultimately did not believe that this particular approach Hayek was putting forward was workable for all kinds of reasons. One was that I didn't think the criterion of a stable purchasing power of money, a stable price level, as it were, was itself a particularly sound criterion for overall monetary stability. Second, I didn't think that the public would necessarily favor banks that maintain stable purchasing power. Even if you thought that was macroeconomically a good idea, why would an individual not favor something like Bitcoin that appreciates over time?
Right.
Never mind the social or macro consequences. The individual is going to optimize based on what's in it for them. So I thought that was a flaw of Hayek's approach. And finally, and this is something that Larry's been very good at spelling out, is it wasn't by any means clear, and it still isn't, that the optimizing fiat money issuing institution that convinces people to trust it won't be able to profit more by breaking its promises than by actually sticking to them and grabbing a big short-term gain. So these were all pretty serious problems with Hayek, in my opinion, but that didn't diminish his
George, let me just stop you for one.
contribution to getting me excited in the whole general idea.
Right. Let me just make sure we're not losing some people. So what Hayek was saying is, just like we wouldn't trust governments with a monopoly on making cars or printing newspapers, why is it that somehow we take it for granted that what the governments around the world should have a monopoly on is issuing fiat currency? And so, of course, lots of, especially free market economists, have been very critical of fiat currency up to then. But typically they would say, oh, we should go back to hard money, like stuff linked to gold and silver.
That's right.
And Hayek was saying, no, I'm okay with fiat currency per se, just let's not have government monopolies on it. Let private firms issue their own fiat notes, that aren't redeemable in anything.
Yeah.
And, competition will prevail. And so you sort of get the best of both worlds. Like, you don't have the resource cost of digging up gold and silver and storing it in vaults, but yet you don't have to, the worry about a hyperinflation when the government runs a printing press too much.
Right, because the people will flock away from its currency to some other superior private alternative. In fairness, Bob, to Hayek, his scheme didn't exclude non-fiat monies as part of the competitive choices people would face. So if a firm wanted to issue a gold-based currency, or even 100% or otherwise, or silver or Bitcoin, of course he couldn't anticipate Bitcoin particularly, but all of these alternatives would have access to the currency competition playing field. And it could be, there's nothing in Hayek that would rule out the possibility that ultimately the market would favor commodity money over any of the fiat monies. That's consistent with Hayek.
Right. So can you tell us a little bit just about the field of monetary economics then? For example, compared to macroeconomics, let's say, are monetary economists more, I don't want to say right wing, but like conservative, like personality wise, you know what I mean? Or is that not can you give us a sense of that? Because I don't know that field very well.
It's a good question. I don't know. What I will say is, first of all, I think good macroeconomics is monetary economics. At least it includes monetary economics. Naturally, it includes fiscal policy as well. But a good macroeconomist certainly should be a good monetary economist to really have a complete understanding of that broad field. And that means, that is, being a good monetary economist means having a sense of monetary history and monetary institutions, understanding those things. So I'm not sure that the better macroeconomists, which means to me the ones who understand money, are more free market, but they do have a better grasp of institutions and monetary institutions particularly, and that could in fact incline them to be more free market because of history's lessons.
Okay, yeah, so let me rephrase where I was coming, and I think it dovetails with what you just said. What I'm trying to get at is, like, as a class, economists are way more conservative or libertarian, whatever phrase you want to use, than sociologists, right?
Okay.
And then within economics itself, I would say probably the people who go and focus on international trade tend to be more free market than the people who focus on labor, I would say. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to say. Like, so the people who go into monetary economics, I'm wondering, because to me, like, the kind of person who cares about that, let me put it this way, the people who go into monetary economics, are they more concerned about the soundness of the currency than other economists are?
I suppose, Bob, but it depends on what sort of monetary economics they end up subscribing to. So monetary economists also, they do come in all kinds of flavors. And it may be that there was a time when monetary economists, of course there was a time when monetary economists were overwhelmingly hard money types or sound money types.
Right.
We've certainly moved away from that a lot, and especially lately with the new developments in monetary thinking, including post-Keynesian monetary economics and now modern monetary theory and all these. So I think that you're identifying a tendency that is becoming less and less evident in the discipline.
Okay.
That's how I would put it.
Okay, well, since you brought them up, can you comment on some of the recent trends, like, for example, Bitcoin and then also the MMT? Just like, what are your thoughts on those two things?
On Bitcoin, the first observation I'd make is that it's the closest thing to what Hayek was actually writing about and hypothesizing about in the pamphlet we were talking about. It is not exactly an example of a private fiat money, but it's pretty darn close. I've written a paper where I classify Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies like it as synthetic commodity money, which is something that, according to my classification, is half like fiat and half not. It's fiat money, and it's like fiat money in that there's no obvious commodity value. I say obvious because ultimately the distinction between a commodity and non-commodity is very subjective. And right. But let's just set that aside. The fact is, there's no obvious thing you do with your Bitcoin unless you're using it with the intent ultimately to realize its exchange value. And but it's like a commodity money in that the scarcity is programmed into it. It's inevitable. You're never going to have more than 21 million Bitcoin. And that's unlike in Hayek's scheme, where the private fiat money issuers, they do have discretionary powers, and they're controlling the value of their currencies in a discretionary fashion, instead of having that value be automatically determined through an algorithm that adjusts quantity automatically, according to a strict rule. So, but anyway, despite those differences, the cryptocurrency world is the closest thing to a Hayek competing fiat money world that we've had. And he was, in that sense, remarkably prescient in thinking about it. So that's what's cool about Bitcoin to me. It's also cool that you could have many different algorithms of this sort that are more fancy, that have the supply adjusting to different outside conditions and all that. And I've talked about how, in principle, you could take any economist's idea of a monetary rule that a central bank should follow, or a feedback rule, etc. One can imagine designing a cryptocurrency where it's built into that. And then you throw away the key and you're stuck with this rule, but it could be a very, very fancy rule. And that actually ties Bitcoin not to Hayek, but to Milton Friedman, who semi-facetiously back in the 70s said we could get rid of central banks and replace them with computers. Well, we now have the capacity for computer-controlled monies that are much more sophisticated than anything that would have been possible back when Friedman first put that forward. So these are some of the things that make Bitcoin fascinating to me as a monetary economist. On the other hand, I don't think Bitcoin itself has the makings of anything like an ideal medium of exchange for all sorts of things, and even setting government interference aside, that of course is an important problem. But one of the things that Bitcoin fans overlook is the extreme difficulty of a new private independent currency unit not just gaining a foothold, which it certainly has, but becoming widely adopted to replace an established official currency, or any established currency, unless that currency is a basket case. Then the network economies that tend to strongly favor an incumbent currency, because by definition that has a huge network. And in the case of the dollar, of course, it's an international network that's huge. If the currency is really, really, really badly managed, like a hyperinflation, we could imagine the network breaking down as people abandon it for an alternative or several. But even then, the dollar has a lot of currencies that are in line behind it before you get to Bitcoin because they have relatively large networks and are not yet complete basket cases. So the chances of Bitcoin really taking off as an exchange medium, not as an investment medium, store of value, what have you, they're a lot slimmer than I think a lot of the Bitcoin enthusiasts would like to believe or actually believe. It's a huge uphill battle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I like to write a lot about what the heck we can try to do to the dollar, because I think we're going to be stuck with it one way or the other as a unit for a long, long time.
Okay. Actually, why don't I just keep asking you about that, and then I can ask you about MMT, because I know I threw two big topics at you. So as far as the Bitcoin thing, it's funny you said that about the fiat currency, because what I have done is I said, look, according to Mises' threefold classification from theory of money and credit, that money can either be commodity, what he called a credit money, or fiat. I said Bitcoin clearly has to be a fiat money. It's certainly not a commodity money, and it's also not a credit money, and so the only one left. And a lot of Austrian libertarian types got mad at me saying, no, especially fans of Bitcoin, because in their mind, what fiat money meant was backed up by the government, fiat, saying, oh, this is the money, take it or leave it, suckers. And I was saying, no, that's actually not the technical definition that Mises gives if you go look at that. And for one, and it's not just maybe a pedantic quibble on my part, I think it's important because Mises is not saying, oh, the reason the dollar is the universally accepted medium of exchange in the U.S. right now is because the government says so. Like, that's giving too much power to the government. Like, you don't really understand monetary theory, at least in Mises' tradition, if you think the government can just declare something is currency and then it will be.
Yeah,
there's a lot more involved.
As that.
Right.
Though some people think that's all that has to happen.
Sure. So anyway, I was getting, because and the reason for the confusion or the ambiguity is back when Mises wrote, and for a long time, up until basically Bitcoin, well, I guess Hayek anticipated it with denationalization of money, fiat, like the free market, voluntary money was always commodity.
That's right.
And the fiat was always, the statist, coercive, forced on you. And so you could see why people would think, oh, fiat means
yes. Well, indeed, and the word has that connotation.
Sure.
But you're absolutely right. Hayek's vision of competing fiat issuers and the actuality of cryptocurrencies are both exceptions to this. And precisely because of the issue you ran into, I thought it was desirable to concoct a new category of types of money to add to Mises' classification, which is what synthetic commodity money is. Because for Mises, what distinguishes fiat money is not simply that the state supplies it. It's the lack of a non-monetary use.
Right.
That's the key. And as I said before, I think cryptocurrencies could be understood as also lacking non-monetary use.
Right.
But they have other features that do distinguish them from the ordinary fiat monies that we're used to. And that's where I think we need a new classification to conform to a new innovation.
Yeah, right. So I'm certainly fine if people say, you know what, we ought to come up with a new term, either for crypto or just in general, a voluntary non-commodity money to avoid this confusion. I'm fine with that. I'm just saying, given the threefold classification that Mises handed down,
if you have
clearly
to pick.
Crypto's got to be, and just to not leave people hanging. Yeah. So to me, like reading Mises' actual definition of fiat money, and like, where are you coming off, Murphy? How could you possibly say crypto? Because like the essential thing is there's somewhat the authorities declare by fiat these arbitrary characteristics that separate the money from non-money. So like $100 bill, that and another rectangular green piece of paper that has a picture of a president on it that's not money. There's nothing special about the characteristics. It's just sort of an arbitrary, well, because the U.S. government said this is legal tender and this doesn't count as money. You see, whereas
that's one view.
Whereas with gold, it's but to be clear, I'm not saying sorry, I shouldn't have said it's money, but like declaring this is a valid U.S. currency. You see what I mean? Like that Mises was trying to get there's somewhat arbitrary. Whereas like with gold coins, it's not that you have to ask some authority, hey, is this actually gold? Like it either is gold or it isn't. You know what I mean? Like that's like a natural thing. And so likewise with Bitcoin, like the difference between, why are there 21 million and not 22 million or 20 million? I mean, that's sort of an arbitrary thing. Or if I'm issuing, like in Hayek's vision, if I'm issuing Murphy notes, like I might declare, what is it that makes it an official, authentic Murphy note as opposed to a counterfeit? And I could list some criteria, but like those would kind of be arbitrary just to, cause scarcity. So, and that's different from when tobacco was money. Like, what is it that makes it tobacco or not? It has more to do with people's subjective needs and so forth. So anyway, I think if one reads Mises' definition of what fiat means, it's not that he's saying, it's backed up by government guns. That's not what he means by.
I think the crucial thing is whether there's an ultimate non-monetary use from which a value can be derived. And you can understand this by thinking of how Mises' terminology matches up with his understanding of the value of money and how it's determined, right? So with a commodity money, of course, we have the commodity value being the ultimate determinant of the value of the units that are used as money. With a fiat money, we have the famous regression theorem where there's ultimately that commodity value, but the government has, as it were, at some point in history, pulled the commodity tablecloth from underneath the medium of exchange that it rests upon it, and the momentum there keeps the thing, as it were, going. And then, of course, with credit money, you have, and it's a crucial classification for explaining some episodes that too many economists overlook. You have a money that is temporarily not redeemable, but the expectation is that it will be redeemed, and so you could treat it like little bonds to dated securities. And all of those things make a lot of sense in light of his theory of value. I think, though, when you get to Bitcoin, for example, you have something where it is fiat in the sense that it fits that better than the commodity theory, because there's no use value. But at the same time, it has the distinction of having no. It doesn't have a manipulable supply, and that sounds a lot like the equivalent of something buried in the ground. It's when we speak about Bitcoin mining, of course, we're making it sound a lot like commodity money, and there is an aspect of it that is more like commodity than fiat. So I say we treat it as a hybrid, which I think is what it is.
Let me ask you, just mentioned Mises' regression theorem. So just quickly for the listeners, that was the idea Mises was saying any medium of exchange, to explain its current purchasing power, you can go back in time to the point when it was just a regular commodity, and that has to be the basis for it, because otherwise how would anybody, how would it get off the ground? How would anyone know how to evaluate the thing in the beginning stages? Certainly its use as a medium of exchange could augment that. And then Mises even has passages, and so does Rothbard, where even if that original commodity usage were to disappear, the thing could still go on. But the point was, at some point in the past, it would have had to have been just a regular commodity. And so what are your thoughts, George, with respect to Bitcoin? Because basically Austrians are of two minds. One strand of thought says, right, Mises is correct, and this is why Bitcoin is going to crash any day now, because this can't work, as Mises proved. And the other line of thought, well, there's actually three. Another line of thought says, no, this is reconcilable with the regression theorem because Bitcoin's a network, or blah, blah, blah. And then the third line says, yep, Mises was just wrong on this one. He couldn't have anticipated Bitcoin, and it's a counterexample.
Well, I think the immediate impression you get from Bitcoin is that it's a counterexample, because it is not obvious what its non-monetary use is that provided the platform or launching pad or whatever you want to call it to get the thing get the thing off the ground, as you say. And I always like to use that analogy of a rocket booster, where you need a certain amount of something to get the thing out into the atmosphere, and then it'll go ahead and rotate around the planet for a good long time before it comes crashing down, which is also not a bad analogy with fiat money, because we know that it tends to depreciate over time. So anyway, I think ultimately for me, the solution is the best solution to this question of whether Mises was wrong or whether, in fact, Bitcoin fits the regression theorem is the one that Conrad Graf offered in a very good paper he wrote some time ago, which asks us to expand our notion of what use value means, to be more subjective about it, and to allow for the fact that things can have a use value that isn't at all obvious. And here I think of Bitcoin as starting out having a use that's not monetary in the strict sense, but it is a useful a token for a game, right? Like Chuck E. Cheese tokens or whatever, right? What are they good for? Well, you can play a game with them. In this case, it's not a question of redemption value. It's just that you're using these things for keeping track of stuff. And so that very limited in use was enough. It was it was a toy. It was a little toy. Monopoly money is a toy, right? But it was enough. It turns out that you can come up with something that's brand new and that doesn't have any use until you come up with it, and you're coming up at the same time with some things to do with it, as you do with a game. And I think that that's really the answer. I haven't expressed it as well as I would like to, but I could come up with a game right now and just invent a little thing that we're going to use to play it. It could be the pieces you use on the board of the game, but you can only use these pieces. That's the rule. The next thing you know, the pieces are valuable. So that the invention of a new entity that had no prior usefulness can come along with the invention of an activity for which it's useful. And that is something like what I think happened with Bitcoin, only it grew and grew until once the thing was established as useful for playing, it became valuable for other things.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I suppose if people were on an ocean liner that crashed on a tropical island, the standard scenario, and no one had any U.S. currency, and they happened to have someone had a game of Monopoly, and they had those things, conceivably, you could imagine you check in 20 years later, and that's their money because they can't print anymore.
Yes, why not the Monopoly money as opposed to some other stuff that they drag onto the shore from the shipwreck that, might also not be very valuable in the context that it finds itself in, like playing cards or let's think of something better, because cards are useful for fun. Let's suppose you have a bunch of nails, but there's no wood on the island or anything like that. You could still find yourself doing something with them that could initially be not exchange, but just a way of keeping track of things, an accounting method or something like that, tallies, right? And the next thing you know, they're valuable.
Yeah.
So we have to be, if we're radically subjective about this, I think the good news is we can get anything to fit into the regression theorem. The bad news is that if we can do that, it's not clear that we have a distinction between fiat and non-fiat money
Well,
anymore.
yeah, right. That was my concern with some of the attempts to salvage Mises on this point was you almost make it vacuous. Like clearly before Bitcoin, what he was saying, like you totally got it. Like, yes, he's really teaching me about the world with this insight. And then to make it non-falsifiable almost seems so anyway.
That's true. Menger's theory of the evolution of money, though, is kind of like that too, right? The good news is it can explain how almost anything can become money. The bad news is it can explain how almost anything can become money. Right? So some theories are like that, and you have to kind of, I guess you've got to, I think I'm inclined to see the glass as being half full rather than half empty in cases like that, because sometimes reality is just very, very, very open-ended, and our theory should reflect that.
Right. Okay, so I had also asked you then about, not that we need to get bogged down on this, but MMT.
Oh, yes.
For the benefit of listeners who just, like to hear Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mentioning it, just what the heck is it? And then how do you, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, I don't know if I could do justice to this question. especially if we're to take on some other topics besides it. But I will say, first of all, that it's important to recognize that MMT is a collection of different ideas. It covers actually all sorts of things. And for example, it embodies or includes views about the origins of money, chartalist views, modern versions of chartalism, which do assign a crucial role to the state.
Mm-hmm.
The state decides what's going to be money. It decides what it's going to accept in payments to itself, especially taxes, but others as well. And this is the thing that ultimately drives, according to MMT, what actually is used in society at large as its generally accepted medium of exchange. That's part of MMT. It's not the part you're hearing about a lot these days,
right.
But it is part of it. The parts that are heard about more lately have to do with the question of government finance. And the principal argument of MMT here is that the government can afford to do anything if any government can afford to pay for anything, so provided it issues fiat money on a floating exchange rate basis. That is, it has a truly sovereign, independent money that it issues, because essentially it has unlimited powers to increase the nominal quantity of the stuff, provided it has arranged things so that it doesn't have a pesky independent central bank that doesn't want to cooperate. But in principle, you can always print enough to pay off anything.
Mm-hmm.
And as with many MMT arguments, this one is true. In some senses, it's true, but one has to be very careful about pushing it too far. And of course, the immediate reaction most people will have to that argument, I think, is a sound one. They'll say, well, yes, the governments do have the ability to pay their nominal debts, as long as they have printing presses with which to do so. They can pay their nominal expenses, but not without any cost to society. The most obvious cost is that at some point, creating too much paper money, or creating too much money more broadly, I should say, will put upward pressure on prices. We'll have inflation, and it's hardly unorthodox to point out that there are limits to the extent to which governments can take advantage of the printing press, and some of them, of course, historically have exceeded those limits with disastrous consequences. Now, the MMTs are not denying this. And to crudely characterize what they do is they'll have maybe every 3 or 4 pages, they'll say, of course, there's a real resource constraint. And that's what we're trying to emphasize. That's all that matters. There are a lot of these phony constraints, like in central bank rules or budget ceilings and so on. Those are artificial constraints that prevent governments from using their printing presses as much as they might to pay for things. But we should not have all those constraints. The only constraint we should have is the recognition that at some point, if you create too much, you're going to get inflation. At that point, then you have a genuine argument for being concerned, for claiming that the government can't afford to do more. Up to that point, you have nothing. Mm-hmm. And all of this is kind of sound, except that they'll make that emphasis, they'll emphasize the real resource constraint every 4 or 5 pages, and in between they'll talk about things as if the resource constraint is never binding, so you don't really have to think about it very much. And so they'll blithely argue, some of them, I don't want to be unfair, but some of them will blithely argue, we can pay for the Green New Deal, and go on and on about that. What they mean is the printing press capacity is there, et cetera, et cetera. But when they're talking that way, they seem to, they don't say, well, we could pay for it up to a point, but we might not be able to without running into the real resource constraint. That's kind of in the fine print. So when they do emphasize it, it's perfectly clear. But a lot of times you get the impression reading MMTs that they don't think we're at all close to the resource constraint and that we might never get there. And that's the part of the MMT argument that I worry about the most. The tendency to honor the resource constraint notion sometimes in the breach.
Right.
Even as they strenuously, if you point this out to them, they'll say, oh, no, look, here we emphasize it here, we emphasize it here. But there are a lot of contexts in which it seems to disappear for just long enough to give people the impression that MMT has found some kind of magic cornucopia that other economists have been unaware of.
Right. I know exactly what you mean, George. Like Stephanie Kelton, for example, will retweet somebody saying like, oh, how could we afford a Green New Deal? And she'll just, have an emoji like rolling her eyes or something like, here we go again. How can we afford? So you're right. They're certainly leading you to believe this is just mysticism. Clearly, we can have a Green New Deal. Clearly, we can have health insurance for everybody. Everybody can go to college, blah, blah, blah. There's no, this is all in our minds. And you're right. They technically do say, oh, no, we understand the printing press doesn't give us real resources. But in practice, the fans of MMT have been led to believe we can have all of this good stuff if just, we would get Mitch McConnell out of the way.
Yeah. So I'm going to put this starkly by saying that I do not think that any body of monetary thought, I say this with regret because I love monetary economics. I think it's fascinating, but nevertheless, I don't think any body of monetary thought that took the resource constraint seriously consistently would find itself developing a mass following, a popular following, such as MMT has mostly recently acquired. That the MMT thinkers themselves may be often pointing out the real limits of what sovereign money can accomplish. They may do that, but it is not by doing that they have achieved this popular following. It is by saying things that sound like there is no resource constraint. That is the secret to MMT's popular success. And just think about it. How many people in the world care about whether there's some subtle innovation and understanding of monetary policy? They don't care. You won't get a popular following for that. You will get a popular following if you tell people they can have health care, jobs guaranteed to them, a Green New Deal, a cleaner planet, a new education system, and so on and so forth. And it's not going to cost anything because we can afford it. If you talk like that, you can get a huge following. And it is that kind of talk that, without the footnote about the resource constraint, that has bought MMT's popularity. And I think in that respect, even if the exponents of MMT know better, and even allowing that they try to make clear that point on occasion, not just rarely. Nevertheless, a lot of people are not reading their message that way. And if they were to try to make it clearer, more consistent, their following would evaporate.
Right. And, we could say these things, and I endorse what you just said completely. That doesn't mean the leaders of the MMT are being dishonest or whatever, but I think, they would have to know that that's certainly a true statement. That doesn't mean MMT's wrong, but what you just said is, to me, obviously correct.
Yeah, and I want to add, I want to be very careful. I've got Stephanie's book right here. I've read most of it. I got sidetracked. And it's 90% of it, maybe that's a little generous, but I'd say a large percent of it, certainly more than half, is perfectly sound, useful stuff. And it does debunk a lot of fallacies. There are people who are too obsessed about deficits, who can't imagine that they ever are useful, and so on. There are still people who think we ought to balance the federal budget every year, that sort of thing. And also the book's got good. It debunks those things. It debunks the trade fallacy obsession, and it does it sound. There's a lot of good stuff in that book. So I want to emphasize this, that it isn't merely by promising lots of goodies to people that MMT has achieved a following. It has valuable things to offer. And I also want to say that some of the MMTs, I think Stephanie is one, Nathan Tankus is another of my favorites, Eric Timoin. These people really know their monetary institutions exceedingly well. They know the nuts and bolts of how the U.S. monetary system works, including the sometimes recondite legal aspects of the workings of the system, as well or better than most people. And they're a force to be reckoned with because of that kind of knowledge. So anyone who wants to just kind of brush them aside as being crazy or ill-informed, etc., is making a very big mistake, both because it's underestimating them and because and therefore missing an opportunity to take on or to really offer serious counter arguments, and because you can learn a lot from them, because they have the institutional detail awareness that most of us could benefit from.
Right. So, and I endorse that as well, George. So I know you know this, but for the folks at home, I reviewed Stephanie's book, and that's how I basically said, I'm going to take, I mean, it was a long review I wrote. I realized I can't just pop this off.
By the way, I read your review. I thought it was very good.
Oh, thank you.
Particularly, I liked, if I may say, to interject, when you pointed out that the advantage of sovereign money is not an advantage that can be used to any extent without losing it. At some point, you lose your money's sovereign status by trying to
implementing MMT.
You use it to the point where you run into those real resource constraints and prices start rising like crazy. The next thing you know, you don't have a sovereign money advantage at all. It's not because it's overlooking the benefits of sovereign money that Greece joined the Eurozone. It had no choice.
Yeah. So, folks, this is bobmurphyshow.com/149. So in addition to linking to George's stuff, I'll put my review in there in case you missed it. But yeah, that was exactly the point I took, George, saying this is serious. Like, and Stephanie Kelton, like, she had some very clever arguments and things in there too. So yeah, they weren't just saying, "Oh, run the printing press, we get everything we want." Like, you understand why people think this is a brilliant new insight. And it's just to us, we realize, wait a minute, they're overlooking something pretty obvious, or like you say, they're mentioning it every once in a while, but leading you to believe, don't worry, that's actually not going to manifest itself.
I think that's right. I think people can read many of their works that last way.
Okay, we could talk about any of these things, but I do want to hit some other topics here. Okay, so we had mentioned this before. I'm going to read. This is something that the Ludwig von Mises Institute published, folks. And here, I'll read it's a 69-page pamphlet, essay, I don't know what you call it. But let me just read the conclusion of it. It says, of course, it may be that a world exists in which praxeology would not provide useful knowledge, but this would not be a world in which either purposeful action or economic knowledge mattered or would be possible. The observations of any non-praxeological economics, even if valid, could not serve any useful purpose. Furthermore, theories of knowledge dissemination and of the market process, however informative they may be, can no more replace praxeology than they can undermine the doctrine of the radically collidic society, nor should they be viewed as prerequisites to the drawing of valid praxeological conclusions. So this is a very Misesian piece that upholds praxeology against, or not against, but like is a thing that's separately important from market process economics. And it was written by George Selgin. So this is amazing.
Well, yeah, I wrote that. I was I was a third year or second year, I can't remember which, grad student at NYU.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was very much a Misesian in those days.
Mm-hmm.
No question about it. How do I feel about that argument now? It's a good question. I'm not even sure because I think my arguments were clever enough, but I'm not sure they were more than clever. Here's what I'd like to say, though, and what I do say in that pamphlet that I think is of lasting importance.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to do not just with my own perspective, but with my understanding of what Mises was arguing when he argued for praxeology. Mises was essentially insisting on a distinction between economic theory and economic history, or history more generally,
mm-hmm.
which is a very strict distinction, where everything we think of today as empirical economics falls under the category of history for Mises. And the best book to read to understand this is his book, Theory and History.
Mm-hmm.
It's a neglected Misesian work that I think many people would benefit from reading, but Austrians should all read that book. So what for Mises, what defines economic theory is just what others have called the pure logic of choice. Economic theory is just the pure logic of choice. Economics is broader than that, and it encompasses all this history, which is the empirics, etc. Well, in the pamphlet, I try to argue that the logic of choice part of economics is very important, and we can't dispense with it. And that's what that conclusion is all about. We can't, if we wave away the assumptions that allow us to talk about the logic of choice, to analyze it, to draw out its implications, we're left with nothing. We don't have a foundation for reasoning about economic phenomena. Because whenever we do that, we're thinking about certain kinds of fundamental behavior. We're assuming the rational behavior, purposeful behavior, people acting to make themselves better off, et cetera, and we can draw a lot of conclusions from the assumption that that's what's going on out there. An assumption that's not necessarily true, but if it isn't, we're in a bad state. We got a crazy world.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a crazy world, but the crazy world you can't theorize about much.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
But if you want to do a lot with economics, if you want to talk beyond the pure logic of choice, you want to start talking about specific episodes. If you and I want to have a discussion about the Bank of Amsterdam or something like that, we've got to talk about history.
Mm-hmm.
We want to have most economic phenomenon are historically contingent to some degree. They refer to specific arrangements that exist at specific times and not as others. All our talk about those, anything you write about those things, draws on what Mises would call history. It's historical. Of course, there's the logic of choice is still in there. It's part of the apparatus for understanding what's going on with these arrangements. But you're outside of the realm of pure theory, which means you're not just doing praxeology. You're doing something more. You're mixing up other kinds of procedures. Mm-hmm. So that's the component or the kind of essence of that pamphlet that I think I might still agree with. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people, I think, misrepresent praxeology by imagining that you can make conclusions about the merits of fractional reserve banking just using praxeology in Mises' strict sense, without history, in other words, in his sense. And I say, no, you can't really say much if that's all you've got. You need both.
Why don't we switch for a second to something less controversial in our circles? Like, what would you say about like minimum wage legislation? Like, what's the difference between what does praxeology tell us versus history on something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think praxeology can tell you that there's such a thing as a market clearing wage, and that if you have a wage rate arbitrarily set above that level, you're going to have a quantity of labor supplied that differs from the quantity demanded, et cetera, et cetera. What the praxeology can't tell you at all is how big how big a difference any particular minimum wage will make, or even if it's binding, even if it is above, whether it is actually above that market clearing wage, and so on. Perhaps a better example of this is the theory of the business cycle, the Austrian theory of the business cycle, where there's a lot of writing out there about how it can't be refuted because it's part of praxeology, it's based on a logical chain of reasoning, et cetera, et cetera. But while that it may be valid as a theory, valid and true are not the same. Logical validity is one thing. Applicability to any particular episode, that requires that some history to establish. And it also calls for history. Again, I'm using the term history in Mises' sense to mean any empirical investigation, drawing on empirical evidence. It takes history to establish the oomph of the theory. How much does it explain? So you could have an episode where the basic conditions of the Austrian theory of the business cycle are met, and you do have credit expansion that is driving interest rates below their natural level, let's say. So you've met that basic requirement, and that you have to establish that much historically.
Right.
But the effects could be teeny-weeny.
Yep.
In other words, the theory itself doesn't really explain that much about what's happening in that episode. It must be some other stuff going on, because the Austrian business cycle component is just too small to explain the depths of the subsequent crash or whatever. So
for an obvious example that, George, like I wouldn't argue, in May 2020, the reason the unemployment rate was so high was because of Bernanke's crazy interest rate policy.
Exactly, yeah. You certainly couldn't argue it without having to do some empirical deep diving to back your statement up. And it's no answer to say, well, I'm sure the Austrian theory is the right theory for this episode because it's logically entirely valid. There's no errors in the chain of reasoning. It's always correct. Something can be always valid and always useless in principle.
Right. Okay, well, that's a great springboard then to go into. I know I only have you for a half an hour here left. What the people want. It's you and me talking about fractional reserve banking.
Fractional reserves. Well, we can't deny them that, Bob. We mustn't deny them that.
Right.
So let's go.
We are, so we believe in consumer sovereignty. So the just a backdrop for people who don't know. So George and I. So in case you don't know this, George, I used to be on your side, like you and Larry White and your we're not Devo, we're Misesians, that article. Yeah. And by the way, again, folks, this is bobmurphyshow.com/149. I'll link to all this stuff. I used to take your guys' side on that, and then it was only later that I flipped, and not so much on the ethical stuff, like is it fraud or not? Because it's I don't want to get into that stuff, and also I'm certainly not going to die on that hill, put it that way. I think there's ways you could write contracts that clearly everybody knows what's going on. There's no fraud per se. But the one that the more I read and whatever, especially reading Salerno stuff, that I did flip on was this claim, and this is what folks George and I debated at the Soho Forum, and George won the debate according to their rules. He convinced more people.
Attach too much significance to those debate outcomes.
Right, I wasn't trying to be underhanded. I just meant
I know.
I didn't mean like you convinced me, but I meant
you could be right and you would lose, and vice versa.
I'm saying according to the the official rules, was Oxford voting or debate rules. You convinced more of the people to change their views than I did in the audience. So that's what I mean when I say George won. And so we debated the proposition that fractional reserve banking, I forget the exact word, is inherently unstable or something like that. And so to me, I read Mises and whatever, I believe that what Mises was his framework, if one believes in Austrian business cycle theory, then you think the thing that triggers it is not just excessive credit creation, but any creation of new fiduciary media. And yeah,
Right.
if it's just a little bit, it's not going to be a big deal. But to me, it's not that, as long as, and whereas in contrast, well, why don't you explain your position then?
Yeah,
Like
sure.
the theoretical level.
Well, first of all, the hill I don't want to die on is the hill where you're fighting to claim that the Mises was himself a fractional reserve banker.
Right.
I don't want to die on that hill. Larry's been trying to fight that battle. I'm perfectly
Sorry, George, let me just please just to clarify for the audience. So, folks, obviously, I'm not saying, if I can prove Mises believed it, then that means
no,
George
I
is
didn't
wrong.
mean that at all, Bob.
No, I know you mean, but I just want, but it is, so just for people to realize that these guys are different thinkers. Larry has not been so, because to me, I think it's kind of open and shut, at least certain passages of Mises. And so I appreciate you being willing to say, okay, maybe Mises does agree with you, Bob, but you're both wrong. That's fine in my book. Yeah.
There are definitely passages in Mises that make it sound to me like he's saying you can't have any fractional reserves without cyclical consequences.
Mm-hmm.
He's not consistent, but there are passages like that. So I disagree with Mises when he talks that way.
Fair enough. Okay, great.
Now, as for where you and I part company, Bob, I think part of the problem is it's not so easy as you think to avoid getting up on the ethics hill and fighting there, but while still maintaining that fractional reserve banking is inherently destabilizing. For example, I reread your piece that you sent to me that was the 2019 piece responding to some of my arguments. And what you say there is you disagree with the idea that a person holding a banknote, let's say, right, holding a banknote is lending to the bank that issued the note. Well, it's hard to sustain that without actually implicitly implying that the note is not an IOU issued by the bank. And of course, that if that's true, the bank not only can cause a business cycle by lending funds that have been provided to it in exchange for that note, but would be violating property rights because what it's lending doesn't belong to it implicitly. So I think it's hard to, it's not as easy to separate the ethics from the economics of cycles as you might think. And that's why ultimately I find myself wanting to say, Bob, no, we have to talk about whether that note is really an IOU or not.
Okay, so let me...
A debt instrument.
If you don't mind, let me try to paraphrase to make sure people are following, because I do see what you're saying now. Okay, so when I said a minute ago, hey, I don't want to die on the hill of ethics and fraud or not, I want to just focus on the economics, what I was referring to is like Walter Block and Hans Hoppe and... was Holtzman a co-author on that one? I think he was.
He may very well have
I know for sure Block and Hoppe think this, or at least they have in print.
Yeah, I know Holtzman does think he does. He does think it.
And they would say things like, look, I don't care. Like they're saying, look, at the very notion of fractional reserve banking, its essence is there are multiple people who think they are the sole owners of a given quantity of money. You know, like they're like, in other words, it's like I give my ounce of gold to the bank in a demand deposit account, so I think it's still, I have access to it. They're just safekeeping it. It's a warehouse. And then the bank goes and lends 90% of it to somebody else. So now there's two people walking around who both think they're the sole owners, have the sole property title to that 0.9 ounces of gold that's in the bank. And
at some point, the bank treated itself as the owner and with the right to sell something to someone else.
And they'll go further and say, and I don't care whether, when I opened the checking account, there was language in the contract saying the bank reserves are, because if I sign a voluntary contract with someone that I'm going to, sell him a square circle for $10, that's still a crazy contract. That's a contradiction. You just by saying something's voluntary, if it's essence, it's nonsense. So what I was getting is I don't want to get into that stuff so much. What I want to focus on is if you believe in an Austrian business cycle theory and an injection of artificial credit that pushes interest rates below their natural level, causes the boom, the unsustainable boom. I want to say, what do we mean there about artificial credit? And there's lots in Mises, and I endorse him saying it's any issue of fiduciary media. Yeah. Now you're saying, okay, Bob, but right there to answer the question, is it like a free, a Larry White type free bank in a regime where banks are allowed to issue notes and they don't need to maintain 100% reserves? If somebody comes along, gives an ounce of gold to the bank gives them a note saying the bearer of this note, can go to any Acme bank branch and get an ounce of gold. You guys are saying it's okay if Acme Bank now, if interest rates, by issuing that extra bank note, if interest rates become lower, and they can even issue more bank notes with that ounce of gold sitting in the vault. If they think the community's demand to hold more Acme Bank notes has gone up, running their optimization and whatever, they will issue more. They'll passively expand the quantity of bank notes, even though that lowers the reserve ratio. Mm-hmm. Guys like Murphy and Salerno are going to say, they're issuing more fiduciary media that pushes interest rates below their natural level, and that's going to cause the boom bust cycle. And you're going to say no, because the community, by being willing to add more banknotes to their cash holdings, cash broadly construed, implicitly they're lending to the bank.
That's right.
And so the genuine saving of the community has increased, and so that's why interest rates should fall. So you guys aren't denying, our insistence that the interest rate if the interest rate drops, it ought to reflect more genuine saving in the community, not just merely the bank printing more notes. But you're saying no, in a free banking regime of the type White and Selgin favor, the only scenario in which the free banks can increase the quantity of fiduciary media out there is when the community wants to save more, namely in the guise of adding more banknotes to their, on average, to their balances. Am I okay so far?
Pretty good. Yeah, I would say our view is that the free banking system tends to behave in a manner consistent with that. But I think the more important point is the theoretical one, that in our view, as long as a banking system, whatever it is, is only increasing the supply of funds it makes available, its lending, to an extent that matches people's willingness to save through that system by holding IOUs of the banks in question, then the flow of funds being made available to borrowers matches the flow of savings being made available to the banks that are doing the lending, and then you're okay, in theory. And the free banking system, we argue, furthermore, is pretty good at doing that, at keeping those things in line. Not perfect. Perfect. And the point I was getting to earlier is it's hard to separate the argument here from the ethical question, because our argument rests on the assumption, on the fact, as we claim, that the IOUs, that the notes and liabilities that the banks are issuing are indeed IOUs, and that willingness to hold on to those IOUs is a reflection of savings. Now, if they're not IOUs, you're still saving by holding them, but you're not offering your funds to an intermediary to lend.
Right.
And at very least, if they're not IOUs, they would be breaking the law by lending the funds. So it's hard to separate those two issues. We can talk about them separately, but the basic question that we have to address either way is, are these things IOUs, properly regarded as IOUs? I think we can't avoid answering or addressing that question.
And so just to continue that then, and again, folks, I lay this out more, and I give references to George's work in the article's called More Than Quibbles, Problems with the Fractional Reserve Free Banking or Theory and Evidence or something like that. I'll link to it, obviously. So what Mises argues, and I think I agreed with it, it's interesting. Back in his 1912 Theory of Money and Credit, he anticipates this type of position, and he said there are some who think the very act of holding banknotes means that are fiduciary media, so they're not backed one for one by gold in the vault, means that the holders of the notes are implicitly lending their funds to the banking system, and so then it's okay for the banks to make new loans to people and for interest rates to fall because savings increase. But Mises rejects that.
Yes.
He says, look, I don't care about the juridical language, but in practice, if these banknotes are what Mises calls money in the broader sense, meaning that, you can go around to merchants, they accept them at par, then they perform all the functions of money proper. And so you're actually not renouncing the advantages of holding money. So if I have an ounce of gold and I go give it to the bank and the bank gives me a 1 ounce note that I can go around and spend at the store, to me, I'm not saving. I'm not renouncing present enjoyments. I have the same utility from that as I would have had from the I'm sorry. It's not that you're not saving. It's that you're not lending to the bank. You're merely exchanging. So I would argue, and I agree with you guys and disagree with Hoppe on this, that if I add to my cash balances, I think I'm saving and investing in more cash. And I think Hoppe disagrees with that. But my point is, if I've already saved and now I have this asset of an ounce of gold and I go to a bank and just exchange it for a demand deposit, I don't think I've lent money to the bank.
Yeah, and I do.
Okay.
And I do.
Right.
That's the difference. And your statement about Mises' perspective, I think, is completely sound. But I think he's wrong. It is true that if I hold a banknote, and I receive it in exchange for the same sum of gold that I've surrendered to a bank, I haven't given up the money services. This is a money substitute, after all, and that's what Mises calls it. And it does give me the benefits of gold. But the services money supplies to me, any money, don't consist only of the resources I can get by exchanging it. They consist of the service of its availability, which is what we mean by saying when people demand money. They demand it to have on hand for a contingency. Now, it's very important to recognize that when Larry and I say someone who's holding a banknote is saving and making their savings available to the issuing bank, we mean they're making it available as long as they don't spend it. As soon as they spend it, they have stopped lending themselves to that institution. That is, their demand. First of all, they're not refraining from consumption, so their savings has gone down. Other things equal, obviously. And if our savings have gone down, that means that if we're saving less, presumably we're not offering as many savings to the bank. So it's a temporary kind of savings, and it could last for a day or a month or whatever. The bank's job is to deal with not just one person's such savings, but a whole bunch of them, take advantage of the law of large numbers, and at any time have a quantity of outstanding credits that matches the real demand to hold the IOUs at any time. And it, of course, can be the case that most of these little contributions of savings to the bank don't last very long, yet in their totality, there's a supply that's fairly steady that lasts a long, long time. And therefore, if the lending is consistent with that totality, that's all that matters for the business cycle to not be triggered. So we can all be saving for a day each, but a lot of us, and you have a certain real demand for these IOUs, that the banks can lend up to that amount, have that many loans outstanding, and you're still okay. Mises didn't like that because he argued that the very fact that we could end our savings at any time he equated that with there not really being any savings offered to the banks at all. And I don't agree on that. I don't think it makes any difference. It's a matter of degree, not of any fundamental difference, whether you think of the IOU as a security with a certain maturity, or you look at it as what it is, which is these banknotes are zero coupon, bearer notes of very small denomination that are redeemable on demand. And if you define it that way, it's not an unheard of kind of instrument. We have, for example, banks do make loans all the time that are callable loans.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a bank note holder is making a callable loan to the bank. Can call at any time. That's a legitimate category. And so it's callable. The securities don't bear any interest in the case of banknotes. That's unusual, but not impossible to fathom, and so on. So I think that if we just look at these things, I think there's nothing illegitimate about looking at these things as little loans. But then, of course, we still have to show that they were so legitimately and not
right.
against the wishes of the holders of the notes. And that's where you get into the ethics.
Okay. I think, let's see. I'm not sure which way I want to go with it. So I think, let me just ask you this. To me, there's a real important thing about this and what would distinguish fiduciary media issued by banks from just, any corporation borrowing money from lenders in the form of callable loans, is that the bank's notes function, at least in certain segments of the community, as equivalent to the money proper, whereas in general, you can't go to the grocery store and spend a callable bond to get your food. So to me, I think that's also why Mises calls the banknotes part of money in the broader sense. So like when banks do this process you're talking about, that, if you describe it in your language, it seems kind of innocuous, but they're expanding the quantity of money, whereas if regular firms do it, they're not so much. And so,
right, they can be, Bob, but the point is, once again, we have to think about what's happening when the demand to hold the bank's notes go up. So that means that the demand for real money balances is going up. In this case, for a particular bank's brand of real money balances, money substitute balances. And that's taking funds out of the flow of spending, right? That would be in itself, would detract from the flow of spending. But what the bank is doing when it acts the way Larry and I think it should, in theory, is it's injecting into that flow a like amount through taking advantage of, through acting as a pure intermediary. So the flow of spending isn't being increased, it's being maintained by banks responding to a greater real demand for their IOUs by increasing the size of the extent of their outstanding credits. And the opposite happens as well. If people start dissaving through the banks, that is, they start spending more and trying to reduce their real balances, then the same process ideally will compel the banks to shrink their balance sheets and thus maintain the total flow of spending that way. And that's what I mean, what I think of as a perfect intermediation system. It's not one where the bank's credits stay constant all the time, but one where they expand or contract according to the real demand to invest in the banks, to put savings into them, temporary savings.
Okay, let me throw the thought experiment at you. And if you said you looked at the paper, you may have already know what your answer is, but so I get your framework, and then I was just thinking through it, and I hit something that I thought was kind of a weird quirk, like an implication of that approach. So I want to make sure that, first of all, you agree with me about the implication, and then how do you respond? So we've got a community, it's initially in monetary equilibrium, and then for some reason, everyone in the community becomes more fearful of the future, and they want to increase their real cash balances. So if it were 100% reserves, they'd have to mine more gold, or prices would have to fall, and that would be painful and, sluggish. but thank goodness it's a fractional reserve free banking regime. And so the banks can just issue more fiduciary media banknotes that aren't backed by additional gold in the vaults. And everyone, suppose it's just like symmetrical. Everyone's identical in their preferences. And every person in the community adds 10% of newly issued banknotes to his cash holdings. And I guess, they're going to have to pay interest to the banks, to pay for those. And then I think to explain that, and then that would maybe push down interest rates a little bit, maybe. But in any event, I think you would have to say what happened was everyone in the community borrowed the extra 10% of cash balances from himself.
Yeah. That's no, that's not how it happens at all.
Okay.
What happens is, let me just take myself, just speak of one person, right? So normally I write a certain number of checks off my bank account, but now I want to add to my balance. I'm getting income and making deposits on a regular basis. So what I do is I still am getting the income. I'm still making the deposits. I write fewer checks. And that's going to cause my bank account to accumulate. I don't need to borrow any money from the bank. Right. I just need the bank account to stop spending as much. I get my extra balances that way. Of course, if everybody's trying to do the same thing, it's only going to be possible if the banks lend more.
Yep.
But here's what happens. The banks, and this is what theory of free banking talks about at some length, and you refer to the discussion in your article. The banks, finding that lower amounts are being drawn off of them and there's less clearing activity, discover that they can get away with lending a little bit more because they don't need as high a reserve ratio. So the accumulation or the attempts to accumulate cash balances encourage more lending, not to the people trying to encourage to accumulate the balances, but to whoever's out there who offers a good lending prospect, right, who has something they can do with funds, provided the interest rate has fallen a little bit more. They're going to be people on the margin. And they're going to get this new money. They're going to spend it on their whatever. Maybe they're going to buy houses or cars, or maybe their businesses doing investments. That's going to add to the flow of spending. And that's going to make it possible for all of us who are trying to accumulate balances to actually succeed in the aggregate, not just individually, because there is, lo and behold, a greater stock of nominal money balances out there to be saved. So it doesn't call for, if my demand for money goes up, I don't have to go to the bank for a loan. I just have to stop spending. But what has to happen, if many people are trying to do what I'm trying to do, is that the bank responds to that by saying, we can lend a little more now. Then we can all actually have our increased savings. If for some reason the banks don't respond, then we're in the same world we'd be in if we had commodity money, where there's going to have to be deflation to achieve the same ultimate equilibrium.
Okay, so the way you're responding to my thought, you're agreeing with my thought experiment. If the answer is what I said it was, that would be weird. It can't be that everyone just lent extra 10% to himself.
They don't have to do that. Okay. Yeah, that's my point.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the way I was getting that,
have to lend to somebody.
Okay.
And that'll allow everybody to hold their bigger bank deposit as desired.
Okay. And so I think if I'm understanding, you're saying, even if it's true, like I said, by hypothesis, that everyone is afraid of the future and wants to augment his cash balances by 10%, to get there, the banks are going to have to lower interest rates such that other people borrow more for investment purposes or whatever.
So
and then
the
that
bank's balance sheets have to grow 10%. And then everybody can have the extra money they want without prices having to fall.
Okay. And in terms of credit allocation and the credit market clearing and interest rates being the quote, natural amount, you would say everyone in the community who is adding 10% to their thing, they all lent that extra money to the bank because that's, they're increasing they could turn those notes back in for gold. They choose not to, so they're implicitly increasing how much gold they have lent to the banks. And then that extra saving is what justifies the fact that the interest rate fell in this thought experiment. That's right. The extra saving in this experiment is measured by the increased real demand for bank balances, notes, liabilities. Right. Okay. And now there's an important caveat here.
it could be that these people are saving more through the banks by pulling out of bond markets and other lending markets. So there might not be a total increase in savings or a general decline in market interest rates, but there's some reallocation of savings from one part of the market to others. Or we could think about a pure case where, in fact, people are accumulating bank balances entirely at the expense of consumption. So they're not dissaving anything. And in that case, clearly you have an unambiguous decline in the overall structure of interest rates.
Sure. Okay, I didn't manage my time properly. We spent more on that than I thought. Do you have time to do the history, or do you need to go?
Oh, yeah, let's go ahead.
All right,
Yeah.
let's do it. All right. So you tell me when you got to stop. Okay, so also in the paper and in the debate, we got into, so the two big things that you and Larry, well, you personally, tell me if you think Larry agrees with you. When you say, look at the two best examples from history of the free banking regime that George Selgin, favor are Canada in the late 1800s, and I'll let you be more specific, and then the Scottish free banking period. Does Larry also like the Canadian one, or do you not know?
I think so. He doesn't talk about it as much. And I should say that it's not necessarily that these are the best illustrations in the sense of the ones that were the most successful or the most consistent with the assumptions of what free banking requires. But they are the two concerning which we know the most, that we know pretty much fit the ideal.
Okay.
They're not perfect. There hasn't been any perfect system, as far as I know, where there's no government at all. But we know a lot about the performance. We have a fair amount of statistics, especially about the Canadian case. And that's probably as much as important as any reason why I like the Canadian case, because we actually have a fair body of knowledge about how it worked.
Okay, great. So why don't we do the Canadian one first? Because that's I think there's not as much a background that you got to explain for people, and we can explain our different perspectives pretty fast. So, oh no, I just should have had this pulled up. I'm trying to. So I was doing a thing at the Mises Institute, a talk on this, and I
You're going to show me the Canadian GDP or GNP for the last few decades. Is that right? Is that the chart?
Well, I mean, we could get in that, but I think that's too hard for people to follow. I just want to do the table of contents thing. The one that you think was a cheap shot.
Oh, here we go. The one from yeah.
Okay, so here's my fairly simplistic observation, and then I'll let you defend. Oh man, I just had it. Defend it here. So, reading your blog post about the success of free banking, and then you said Canada is one of my favorite examples, and then you said it's remarkably stable or famously stable, and then you link to, and there's this authoritative treatment on the period under the Confederation from 1867 to 89. And it's from this book Breckinridge in 1895, and so
longer than 89. It goes on more or less till World War I.
So sorry, you're right. What I'm looking at there is the
table of contents,
the chapter. That's the title of chapter 8. So you're right. So the book itself is a broader period, but it's covering the period that George says, folks, is an example of, look at the remarkable stability of the Canadian system when it approximated the institutional framework that I and Larry White favor. So I'm like, okay, and George is telling me this thing, so let me go see, what the damage is here. How am I gonna, as a Rothbardian, address this? And so lo and behold, I pull up chapter 8, which covers the period. So the title of chapter 8 is Banking Under the Confederation, 1867 to 89, which is, part of the period that George is talking about. So the first few pages is the expansion between 1867 and 1873. The next section is Depression, 1874 to 79, and the next section is Bank Failures and Losses, 1874 to 1879. So, just superficial or prima facie to me, I was like, this is hilarious, and I know you're going to say that it's not funny, George, because the whole point funny, was for Salerno.
It's not the slam dunk argument against the Canadian system that
right. So let me show what I'm in the air with the basketball trying to slam it, and then you tell me why it's going to bounce off the rim.
Sure.
That I'm prima facie. I mean, the whole argument from guys like Salerno and then me when I understood what he was saying is what we're saying is the Austrian business cycle theory is going to happen with fiduciary media, not just if there's an evil central bank coercively, forcing artificial credit, but even in the type of regime that Larry White and George Selgin favor, banks that issue fiduciary media are going to be causing the unsustainable boom. And so then when George says, look, at Canada is pretty good in terms of the kind of thing we favor, and I go and look at it, and the guy who's the authority that George cites has, what happened in the Canadian system was when it started, there was this expansion. Then there was a 5-year depression where a bunch of banks failed. And so to me, I was like, yeah, isn't that exactly what the Rothbardian would say? In other words, if there hadn't been any boom bust cycle, then you guys could say, see, I thought you guys told me there was going to be a business cycle, but there wasn't. But so anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, sir. So first of all, when I say the Canadian system was remarkably stable, I mean it was remarkably stable compared to other monetary and banking systems in the world, real world systems at that time, and many since. And Breckinridge, who's the authority we're referring to here, says the same thing. His conclusion, as you know, and you cite this in your article, is also that the Canadian system was remarkably successful. Now, let's talk, though, about those chapters and those chapter headings, because it's very important that we clarify that what they do and what they don't imply. I should say, first of all, that properly speaking, the Canadian free banking era begins with the passage of the first Dominion Bank Act. So that's like 1870. Mm-hmm. So the period before that we might not want to include, but that's a minor point. The more important point is that nobody, certainly not me, nobody claims that free banking, in the best possible free banking system, is a panacea that's going to absolutely eliminate cyclical ups and downs. There are all kinds of factors that contribute to cyclical ups and downs, to business depressions and booms, that the banks may be completely innocent of. And if you read Breckinridge, and I know you have, he says, after talking about these episodes, that the banks were not to blame for them. They were, to some extent, caught up in them. So then, of course, the question arises, and it's a particularly important one for your audience. Well, if it's not the Austrian business cycle, what kind of cycle are we talking about? And there are all kinds of answers to that. But one thing to keep in mind is that, first of all, there are real cycles. There are real business cycles, real shocks, particularly in heavily agricultural economies. You can have a bad harvest, etc. You can also have cycles that are driven by gold flows, where there's a lot of gold flowing in with a balance of payments at some times and flowing out in others. We've had a lot of historical episodes where countries didn't have any great fluctuations in the fiduciary components of their money supply. This is back in the gold standard days, but where the real driving force was the changes in the actual gold in the economy. And a good example of that is a very stark example is the Australian banking crisis of 1893. It was almost all capital flows, and it was gold-based. I have an article called Bank Lending Manias in Theory and History, where I show that a lot of the most famous boom-bust cycles were driven by gold flows. Mm. That's not a critique of the gold standard, but the point is that in any economy, world economy, or any large monetary union, you're going to have parts of that union that are gaining gold in certain periods and others that are losing. And we can speak about the business cycle of Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And you're going to see times when Connecticut's badly off and other times better off, but nobody cares about that. So Canada was part of an international gold system, gold standard in this period. And there were times when it was better off than others that had nothing to do with the banks. So that's one important point, is that you can have cyclical movements in output. And you showed a nice chart in your article that GDP was not stable, but those movements aren't attributable necessarily to changes in the fiduciary media or to the Austrian cycle mechanism that those changes are supposed to trigger. And Breckinridge shows or argues that, in fact, in Canada, the banks were not the driving force. Bank lending was not the driving force in those cycles that he talks about. It's also the case that I've studied the relationship between the gold supply in Canada and total spending. I have a little Altem article about that. And I compare that relationship to what's going on in the United States. But for our purposes, what matters is I found there was a very close relationship between a fairly stable relationship between total spending in Canada, nominal GDP, and the gold base, which is again evidence that the big fluctuations in spending that are happening, which presumably would drive fluctuations in real output, are mostly attributable to changes in the gold stock, not to changes in the fiduciary media ratio or whatever you want to call it. So one has to look more closely to see exactly what's going on before concluding that any instability is the fault of the banking system. So that's one point.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to get bogged down on that so much. So I think I made my prima facie point and you responded. And then the other one, though, just to mention is, because I'm reading your Altem responses, Breckinridge certainly does talk about, hey, like one of the statistics, and that you cited as well to try to show this was stable, is what a low percentage of depositors ultimately didn't get their money back.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only thing I want to mention on that is, two things. One is that's not the criterion, in other words, like when Salerno or I were arguing that, this is going to cause a boom bust cycle, and so it's unstable or it's destabilizing. We weren't saying, and therefore a bunch of depositors are going to lose their money. Like that might happen too, and that would be unfortunate, but that wasn't the essence of the boom bust cycle.
That's not the same thing as the cycle theory.
Right. And just like one wouldn't argue, the U.S. banking system from 2007 to 2012 was remarkably stable because no depositor lost any funds.
Yeah, of course.
So,
yeah.
Okay.
No, my claim is not my claim was not that because the losses to depositors were modest, they were very modest compared to the U.S. case, certainly. That itself doesn't prove that the banks were not involved in cyclical fluctuations of real output. That doesn't establish that at all.
Okay.
So that's a separate argument. But because Breckinridge had a chapter on losses, I wanted to make sure people understood that the evidence he was providing in that section was not evidence that losses in the Canadian system were particularly bad.
Okay.
They were actually not bad at all compared to the U.S.'s. The U.S. case is a low bar during that time. Let's be fair.
Right.
So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is how much better the Canadian system was compared to the U.S. system of that time. And it's important because it goes to the question of whether the real problem in the U.S. was the lack of a central bank, which is what you hear so often. And in Canada, they really actually, and gets to the nub of our discussion, one of the reasons why I think it is fair to call the Canadian systems and Scottish systems successful is simply the way the people who had to deal with those systems responded to them. They didn't complain about them the way that we complain about our system and the way many people complain about different banking systems today, or the way people complained about it here in the past or in England in the past. The fact is that it was notorious, say around 1895, it was notorious that the Canada system was so much better than the U.S. system. And in the same way, in England and in Britain, it was notorious in 1840 that the Scottish system was a lot more stable than the English system. So everything's relative, right? We're talking about how these systems were perceived at the time, both by the people who had to deal with them directly or by observers from neighboring countries who had them to compare their own systems with. And that's where you had accolades. Who brags about their monetary and banking system anymore? So now you that does not exclude in itself, of course, the possibility that as successful as these systems were relative to other fractional reserve systems, it could still be the case. I would argue against it, but it could still be the case that these people, everybody would have been much happier if they'd had a 100% reserve system. The problem there, Bob, and it's hard to argue on this, is the simple fact that we don't have a lot of experience of 100% reserve systems to go by. So it's easy to convince people that the counterfactual would be everyone's happier. We don't know that. We do know, and I have looked into how actual 100% reserve banks that have existed have functioned, and they had problems. And one of the problems was that they seldom stayed 100% reserve for very long. So it's not clear. There are costs to 100% reserve banking that mustn't be overlooked. And one of them is that in some circumstances, they can actually be worse at maintaining monetary equilibrium. We talked about that. I argued that point earlier. But the other is simply that you get less savings that are being invested productively through bank intermediation, which detracts from potential economic growth. And that can add up to a big cost in the long run, especially.
Okay, yeah. So let me just restate, because in our Soho forum debate, in response to you saying things like this, I tried to make a point, and I think because you're rushed, you only have the clock's ticking. I don't think I said it well. Yeah. So you said something along the lines of, if you go and look at all the major bank crises, things that economic historians will agree this was a bank crisis, throughout history. George Selgin, can always point to lots of other interventions from the government into the banking and monetary systems. Besides, there were other things going on. It wasn't merely that fractional reserve banking was allowed. And so if you only restrict yourself to those historical periods where there was relatively, little government intervention, but they did allow fractional reserve banking, those regimes are remarkably stable compared to these other ones. All right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I have no problem with that. And, I'm perfectly happy to say, oh, right. Yeah. Some regime that I could point to the Gulag under the Soviet Union and say that's clearly worse than the Scottish free banking regime. And to be more serious, the English banking system was better and the U.S. system was worse than the Canadian. I think those are more germane comparisons. No, sure, but I'm just making the point that that doesn't therefore prove free banking is great in your guys' sense. It's just, likewise, yes, a system that allows fractional reserve banking and has restrictions on branch banking is going to do a lot worse, and maybe the restrictions on the branch banking are way more significant than the fact that a bank is allowed to issue fiduciary media, that kind of stuff. So that is the only point I was making, that clearly, if you're going to look around in history to say where are the worst crises and define your gauge of how bad is a crisis, then the places that have 16 different things the government's doing, like price controls and running the printing press, those are going to be worse than the place that, has pretty close to free bank, or, what you guys think is free banking, but allows fiduciary media. So that was the only
I think
point
the
I was trying to
evidence
make.
is consistent with that. Yeah.
Okay. Do we need to stop here, or can we bring up Scotland? It's up to you.
Go ahead. Yeah, bring up Scotland.
Okay, so the Scottish case, so this is the other, like I said, the other major empirical one, and this is the one that, of course, Larry White, made famous. And so Rothbard, let me just read this paragraph. It's not too long. To set the scene, and then I'll go ahead and let you give the historical background here to try to explain this away. So it's odd, one might think, holding up the Scottish free banking period as an example of, this is our system, not perfectly, but close to action. And Rothbard says, from the beginning, there is one embarrassing and evident fact that Professor White has to cope with, that free Scottish banks suspended specie payment when England did in 1797, and, like England, maintained that suspension until 1821. Okay, so folks, this wasn't like the banks were closed for 3 weeks. This is a 24-year period where the Scottish banks did not redeem their notes for specie, or at least that was the official policy. Free banks are not supposed to be able to or want to suspend specie payment, thereby violating the property rights of their depositors and note holders, while they themselves are permitted to continue in business and force payment upon their debtors, ... White correctly notes that the suspension was illegal under Scottish law, adding that it was, quote, curious, so I think that's White's word, that their actions were not challenged in court. Not so curious if we realize that the suspension obviously had the British government's tacit consent. Okay, so that's Rothbard, who I think initially liked White's writings on this and then had a change of heart. And so this is, kind of how modern Rothbardians respond to this stuff and say, aha, you guys, you're holding this up as the ideal. They suspended specie payment for 24 years. Give me a break. How is this free banking? Or if this is free banking, I want no part of it. So go ahead.
Well, it's a difficult choice. When you have a banking system, a free banking system, of course, one of the things that fractional reserves definitely does is to create greater risks. There are risks in fractional reserve banking that are just not present in 100% reserves. And for the most part, the Scottish banks dealt very well with these risks, as the Canadian banks did. But sometimes you get a shock that's pretty huge, and you're confronted with a very difficult choice. What happened in 1797 was that England was invaded by a French landing party. And the Bank of England was already in a very precarious situation, such that it had to suspend gold payments. Now, that confronted the Scottish people with a very difficult situation, not just the banks, I say the people, because everybody was affected, of course, would be affected by whatever route they chose to take. And they had two options. They had been they were on, since 1707, a British pound standard. Mm-hmm. They were a currency union with England, and it had been a fruitful currency union. So now they had a very difficult choice. They could either maintain the British pound unit and stay part of the British currency union, which is what they decided to do, for the duration of England's own suspension, or they could break away, maintain their own gold payments, and have an exchange rate. They probably would have had to have an exchange rate devaluation at that point, though. They chose the former route. And they didn't quite break the law when they did that. They did announce their policy. They had public meetings, and they met with all the townspeople. There were a few places where they did this. There was only one provision in the British legislation that changed the legal situation in Scotland as well, and it was important. It suspended summary diligence, which meant that you didn't automatically have a case go to law because the bank didn't turn over gold for a banknote. There had to be an actual proper process for suit. That was the legal change. And that legal change meant that the banks were less likely to actually be taken to court. So it wasn't simply the British saying that the Scottish banks don't have any legal obligations. They changed the cost, as it were, of trying to enforce summary diligence or immediate payment on the notes. And I talk about this in a 3-part response I have on this restriction. Anyway, it was a very difficult situation. And I believe thoroughly that the choice made by the Scottish bankers with the public's involvement was what the public preferred. The reason is, remember that this is a small community, and there are two kinds of people, but sometimes one person is both. There are the people who are lending to the banks, and there are people who need to borrow from the banks. Two things would have been true if the Scottish banks hadn't suspended. One is, as we know, that there would have been a continuing ability of the savers to take gold out without restriction and without limitations. The other, which is related to that, is credit would have completely dried up. Would have dried up because with the Bank of England having suspended, this basically anybody could indirectly just draw all the gold out of the Scottish system one way or the other. There are all kinds of reasons why that would happen because of arbitrage. Basically, Scottish banks would be a source of gold for less than it was costing anywhere else in the UK. So people faced a really stark choice. If the bank hadn't suspended, they would have had every reason to think that the supply of Scottish bank credit would have completely collapsed. And so of those two possibilities, this is not quite absolving the Scottish banks, right? But of those two options, suspension was almost certainly the one that was more in the interests of the well-being of the average Scottish person, including the depositors, because they would ultimately have suffered from the lack of bank credit facilities. So I view that episode, in short, Bob, it's a case of a tragedy. There was no good choice. In principle, of course, if you hadn't had fractional reserve banking all along, then this dilemma wouldn't have existed. Well, it would have existed, and there would have been a dilemma of having to not be part of the currency union anymore, and whatever cost that would have of having an independent Scottish currency. But there wouldn't have been any collapse of credit. The problem is that if Scotland had that system, it also would have suffered in the long run from a lack of economic development. So I think the average Scottish person was actually made better off by this arrangement of suspension than in the other possible worlds we could envision that either involve fiduciary media without suspension and a collapse of the system, or a system that was 100% all along and didn't provide the long-run growth prospects that the Scottish system actually did provide.
Okay, so is this a true statement, though? That it sounds like what you're saying is, well, yeah, this regime, that we're pointing to as one of the historical success stories, not perfect, but pretty close to approximating, the ideal. Because they had a fractional reserve system, they found themselves one day in a position where they had to choose between suspending specie redemption for 24 years or the system collapsed. And once they were in that binary choice, they chose to suspend redemption. So I'm saying, doesn't that kind of redound to the credit of the people saying, fractional reserve banking is kind of risky and it's a not very stable foundation for your banking system?
No, I don't think it does, because we have to think of all the different counterfactuals. So I'll play the representative Scots person.
Okay.
The one thing we can't abstract from is the actual initial shock, the invasion and its consequences. Let's suppose that it doesn't matter. That's going to happen no matter what banking system Scotland has. Then the question is, okay, would the average Scots person be better off not having access to a fractional reserve system, being in a 100% system is when that shock hits, or being in the fractional system with suspension, or being in the fractional system without suspension? And I would rank the order of desirability of those three actually as best is what they did, fractional with suspension. Next to that, fractional with a crash, believe it or not. Next to, and no suspension. And the last in the list, 100% reserves. And the reason is that although the crash would have been very disruptive, it would have been a crash of a credit arrangement that itself had been very beneficial and would become beneficial once again. Whereas with 100% reserves, you're never going to have any of those benefits of having a bank credit arrangement that contributes to economic growth. So you might, in the long run, still have been better off with a crash than with a 100% system, where your Scottish public savings aren't contributing anything to economic growth, your monetary savings. And Adam Smith, the reason I believe that, and I'm putting it starkly to be provocative in part, I actually kind of believe this. Adam Smith's book 2, chapter 2 about money is where he waxes eloquent about the Scottish system. And mind you, this is before, right? This is 1776. And he's saying how up to that point, the system has provided all these benefits for economic growth. It's a very profound chapter because it talks about how fiduciary media contributes to total investment. And in those days in Scotland, it was extremely important. Bank savings, bank intermediated investment isn't a big part of total investment in modern economies. But in those days, it was really important. And so if you read that chapter and you think, okay, here's all these benefits that are accruing from the system right up through 1776, and they're going to keep on accruing until 1797. And now let's imagine that because of suspension and a crash, non-suspension and a crash, you have this collapse. And eventually it's going to take you years to get out, as usually happens. And then you're going to be back in that system, and it's going to go on for another 30 years or 40 years. Overall, I think the economy would have ended up better off at the end of the free banking period, even with a crash, than if the Scottish economy, than if it had had 100% reserves from the get-go. That's what I think.
Okay. I probably disagree. Well, I know I disagree with it, but even if that were true, though, it seems interesting to me because I thought one of your guys' main points was to say not that, a fractional reserve free banking system provides over a 50-year time span the highest amount of average real GDP growth, but they're saying this was a much more stable system. That when there's changes in the data, we don't have these crashes and whatnot. This is just the system passively responds. Whereas now it seems like you've flipped and said, oh, yes, our system might require a huge crash that takes years to dig out of. But
no, because that would be true, Bob, if I were saying that the system that they shouldn't have suspended, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that would have been the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. I think they did the right thing by not suspending. So now we don't have a crash. We still have the growth. And what we do have, what the cost here, there is a cost. Mm-hmm. The cost is that for a few years, there wasn't even this cost. But after a few years, as you know, the British pound began to depreciate relative to gold. And the argument there is that some depositors were made worse off, not only by their lack of complete access to gold for certain transactions, but ultimately by this deterioration in the value of their Scottish IOUs. Mm-hmm. Now, it's still, that last factor is actually itself a little tenuous because remember that this took 7 or 8 years. People had plenty of time to adjust their expectations, et cetera, and interest rates. Mm-hmm. So it's not clear how much was lost by the depreciation of the pound ultimately after so much passage of time. But in principle, there were costs to that solution that was actually chosen. But those costs were minor compared to the alternative of having the system crash by trying to keep it on a gold basis.
Okay. I'll end with one last one, and I'm being intentionally provocative here to end this interview, and I appreciate your time. So first I'll say what my position is, and then I'll try to be provocative with an analogy. So to be clear, I'm not here saying these episodes, the Canadian one or the Scottish one, necessarily prove that free banking, in the sense you guys use the term, has failed. It just, especially the Scottish case, it seems, especially because you admit in your Alt-M pieces that part of the reason that they couldn't issue small denomination notes was because the Scottish bankers had lobbied for those restrictions and whatever. So part of the reason they were in this straitjacket, according to you, that where they had no choice but to suspend redemption was because of earlier limitations on banking that they themselves had lobbied for. So what I want to say is, it's not that I'm saying, this proves free banking in the Selgin Whitesons doesn't work. It's just odd to me that you still hold this up as an example. To me, it's like if Milton Friedman's arguing for why we need an all-volunteer military, And he pointed to the U.S. during the years of the Vietnam War as his prime example of why an all-volunteer military works. And people are, but there was a draft. He goes, right, but I mean, if you look and you can see, I can, like, it's not that he would be wrong, but that would be a weird thing. So likewise, it seems weird you're pointing this period where there was a 24-year suspension is vindication of your guys' theoretical model where the banks optimize in the reserve ratio because we don't, if somebody shows up and we can't redeem, we're done for. And so that's how we optimize the, reserve ratio. And yet, anyway, I think you get my point.
Well, first of all, we're not focusing on that period necessarily. Scottish banking has a history of about a century, depending on where you slice it. Some would take it back even as early as as the Act of Union, even, and it goes on, by the way, for some time beyond Peel's Act or that Act's extension to Scotland in 1845, because for some time after that, a few decades anyway, not much changes. That Act doesn't become all that binding. So there's a long history there. Okay. That's one point. The second point is one I stressed before. We can't be too fussy because free banking hasn't been allowed that often. We have to choose from among the episodes that most closely approximate it, and they're not perfect. And among those, we naturally want to look at those for which we have a fair amount of information. And lo and behold, one of those is Scotland, and darn it, they had this suspension. But that's the next point, which is there's nothing in our theory that says that a free banking system is going to be immune to rare but serious shocks like an invasion. That's going to be a problem for all sorts of systems. And it's going to mean that for a while they're not doing what they normally do, though you can still theorize about reserves and all that, but it's British pounds now, that the Bank of England money, that's the reserve, the proximate reserve. But we have to, again, be fair here. We have to ask ourselves what's the counterfactual. I could imagine, I wish we had more evidence, and I think we probably could come up with some. I could imagine a country that's got a 100% reserve system, right? Maybe, who knows what the underpinnings are, where an invasion causes a dramatic change. The government decides to start manipulating the system or whatever. And so all kinds of things can happen when you have a big enough shock to any system that it make it difficult to argue that any arrangement is immune to any sort of contingency. And so I think the way the Scottish banks handled this very serious contingency, given their relationship with England, and, this isn't just a neighboring country.
Right.
This is London and the financial center for the world at the time. It's not so easy to break away from that system costlessly. I should have mentioned that it can be done. When the U.S. in the Civil War suspended gold payments, the West Coast, Oregon and California especially, they kept on the gold dollar.
Yep.
And not only that, they were on something like 100% reserve because they didn't like banks, which is one reason why it was easier for them to do that, because if they'd had fiduciary media, they would have had a crash. So that's an interesting counterexample. But I'm not sure they were better off than they would have been if they'd had a flourishing banking system like the rest of the country. They did have a different gold unit. So this would be a comparison worth exploring for the sake of this debate. So it's possible. But again, we're stuck with the examples that we have. And I don't think you can judge a system according to what happened when it was exposed to an extreme shock of the sort that might happen once in a century, if that. And I think the Scottish system handled that shock pretty well. We might wish we could have had a better situation, but I'm not sure it's easy to imagine that the system could have come up with a better solution.
Okay, well, and fair enough, and thanks. And yeah, you in your gold standard essay that you sent me a couple weeks ago, I saw that was the first time I'd heard about how the Western banks stayed on. So yeah, that was something that I wish we had more time. I would ask you to elaborate on. Okay, folks, this is bobmurphyshow.com/149. Of course, I'll give links to all the stuff we've talked about. My guest has been George Selgin. George, thanks so much for your time, and I'm sure people got a lot out of this.
I hope they do, Bob. I've enjoyed it myself. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.